This is the story of the Citicorp Center, a 59-story skyscraper in New York City that had to be secretly rebuilt to avoid collapsing in a hurricane the very same year. Pause. How did this even happen? Well, the whole saga started out with an act of God. No, not a hurricane, at least not yet. This particular divine intervention came in the form of St. Peter's Lutheran Church, which sat very stubbornly on the land where developers wanted to build something taller, shinier, and as it turns out, significantly more life-threatening. So let's rewind. In the late 1960s, real estate brokers Donald Schnabel and Charles MacArthur had a brilliant idea: buy up plots of land on the block at 54th in Lexington. Why? Because if there's one thing more valuable than a little plot of New York City land, it's a big plot of New York City land. They formed a brokerage firm called Lexman and started assembling the pieces, but there was one tiny little problem. St. Peter's Lutheran Church didn't really feel like selling, which in a city where real estate development is basically a contact sport, was a church-sized inconvenience. After much negotiating in 1969, the church agreed to a deal. They'd sell their land and their ultra-valuable New York City air rights in exchange for partial ownership of the new development and a promise that a new church would be built on site. With that hurdle cleared, the developers brought in Citibank, then known as First National City Bank, to fund and occupy the new skyscraper. The last piece of the land puzzle on 844 3rd Avenue was secured in 1975, with the final plot costing a then record-breaking $40 million, or about $235 million today, making that the most expensive plot of land at the time. That left one remaining issue. How do you fit a massive skyscraper and a church in the same place? The design solution was to elevate the skyscraper on 4 giant stilts, each positioned in the center of the building's edges rather than at the corners, leaving plenty of room for the new church below. It looked futuristic, it looked efficient. It also looked like a giant game of architectural Jenga waiting to go wrong. To make sure the building didn't sway wildly in the wind, structural engineer William J. Lemaitre designed an exoskeleton of V-shaped chevron braces and installed the first of its kind, a tuned mass damper, a 400-ton concrete block that floated on pressurized oil bearings swaying in real time to counteract the wind forces. That should have been the end of the story. Unfortunately, however, it was not. Fast forward to 1978. Lemaitre gets a call from a random undergraduate student, Lee DeCarolis, from the New Jersey Institute of Technology. His professor had some concerns about the building's design, and Lee, working on his report assignment, decided to call the actual structural engineer for an answer. Lemaitre, amused, took a second look at his calculations, and then he realized something. Somewhere along the way, during construction, a small change had been made to the building's frame, without his approval. Instead of the planned welded joints, the builders had opted for cheaper, weaker, bolted joints. Now, under normal circumstances, this wouldn't have been a disaster, but if the tuned mass damper failed, say due to a power outage in a storm, those weaker joints wouldn't be enough to keep the building standing. And wouldn't you know it, Hurricane Ella was barreling straight towards New York City. At this point, Lemaitre had 2 choices. Number 1, admit the mistake publicly and cause a mass panic, or number 2, secretly fix the problem before anyone found out. He wisely chose option 2. In the dead of night, under the guise of routine maintenance, construction crews were sent in to quietly reinforce the joints. At the same time, an emergency backup generator was installed and extra staff were hired to keep the tuned mass damper operational at all costs. Thankfully, Hurricane Ella veered off course before reaching New York, but modern assessments suggest that even if the storm had hit, the wind loads might not have been as catastrophic as originally feared. Still, it remains one of the most terrifying oops moments in architectural history. And that is the story of how one of New York's most famous skyscrapers nearly became an accidental demolition project. If you want to build your very own skyscraper and maybe not have it almost collapse in a hurricane, you're going to want to learn something about architecture, so make sure to subscribe.